Started off with sketches for the boxed out form to reference to, using the symmetry tool to create the basic shape of it and the silhouette of the model. Used the subdivision modifier to smoothen out those forms, applied it and started sculpting to mesh the form of the drawings, remeshing it so that you have even more polygons to work with, joining the objects and converting them all into a single mesh. Here's where you can really start to see some of the details start to pop out, especially in the face. Trying to go for a more orc form here. I think the skin layers around the eyes really gave it a new form of life. This kind of looks like draw the whole owl kind of thing, but really it's just a bunch of stamp tools, or as Blender likes to call it, the anchor brush. And using existing textures from textures.com, you can really start to add a lot of detail to the body. Obviously added the teeth and the horns up there, added more detail to everything, and really filled out the forms of the hands a bit more. They're still looking a little janky. In the end, after I finished adding as many details as I felt comfortable with, the model got up to around 450,000 polygons. And this is actually you're looking at the mesh form here. It's just there's so much detail that it just looks like one continuous mesh. But this is actually the wireframe view. And after you apply retopology techniques, this is what it starts to look like. And this is down to around 14,000 polygons. If you look closer, you can see that I had to go in and add more polygons to specific areas where the skin would be stretching once it is animated, specifically around the interior creases, like in the armpit or where the forearm meets the bicep, or especially in the neck area. But in this screen, you can see where I created seams so that I could eventually start preparing for the UV editing. In this image, only half of the UV edits are done. That was done on purpose in order to save time, and you could just mirror it over, because the whole model is symmetrical. Also, here's where I've added the belt buckles, the loincloths, and the metal cuff. Something you'll notice is that this model is still very low poly, and a lot of the details have been lost from the 450,000 polygon version of the model. So what you can do is actually bake those details into what are called normal and cavity maps. So here's the creation of the normal map, which is taken from the high poly version of the model. It's called baking because you're printing those details onto a 2D image that is then projected onto the low poly version of the model. Here's what it looks like after you apply the normal map and creating the cavity map from the high poly and transferring it over to the low poly. So the normal map and cavity map have been attached through the nodes onto the low poly version of the model, and it looks more high res than it actually is. Here it is again with more details added. And that cavity and normal maps extended over to the clothing and the teeth and horns. Once that's done, you can start creating a base color map, which here's where you start to choose what colors everything should be. In this base color map, you can add more textures as well to add even more detail. If you notice, there is kind of a sheen over the entire model, and that is unintentional, and it is fixed in the next screen, where you can see that I added a roughness map. So all the dark areas are where it is a little bit shinier, and all the lighter areas are where it's going to be rougher. So if you look at the belt buckle and the metal cuff, you can see, and the nails and the horns and the teeth and the eyes, you can see that those are shinier than the skin. In order to make that happen, you have to create a roughness map and apply that also to the low poly model. And here's what it looks like with the polygons overlaid on top of the low poly model. You can see where the low poly still exists, but where the new textures are all kind of baked in, and you can see it there in its final form. In the end, the final version of the model was taken down to 14,000 polygons. So after that was done, it was time to start animating. And that meant learning how to use keyframes, which was a challenge for me, but once I broke it down into something simple and digestible, like just moving around a square and a camera, stretching it, and moving it around and rotating it, it was easier to understand the basic concepts of it. And I applied it to this animation, which you can see here. Pretty basic, but then I learned how to use the armature tool as well, alongside with the keyframes and animation, and animated a little snake to try and get the basic concepts of that as well. So then applied that armature, that basic set of bones to the model, and tried my hand at animating it. Here is, on the left, the typical skeleton rig versus on the right, the inverse kinematic rig. So the difference was that the one on the left is manipulated through the joints. Any animation is done from the rotation around the joints, whereas on the inverse kinematic rig, you can actually just, for example, grab the fist and move it around, and the rest of the body moves with it, which is a lot easier to use. And in the process, learned how to use both forms of rigs and created my first attempt at a walking animation, which you can see here. Very snazzy. But then I realized that you can actually import animations from a website called Maximo and use it as a reference tool to import some animations. But because my character was not the typical shape of a human being, had to adjust some of the weights. And what weights are, as you can see from this image, the more red it is, the more affected by a specific bone. If I were to click on the left hand bone, the left hand would turn bright red, similar to how we're seeing the head here. So in order to make those imported animations work, you had to go in and clean up the individual bones and make sure that the proper ones were highlighted red. After all of that, I found out that you can actually edit video and audio within Blender itself. Took the opportunity to touch up and practice on some of my video editing skills and apply them to Blender, which you can see here. And that's about it. Overall, the model took about a month and a half to complete, especially because I took all these notes in the process and followed the tutorial very slowly so I could learn the process. And that's about it. Here's what it looks like fully finalized, just the model by itself. Looking forward to repeating the process with a new character design. This time it'll probably be more complex. I was thinking more of a robot design, but we'll see where it goes. Catch you later, and thanks for watching.